everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I hope that you're in a nice, cozy spot to listen to me talk for an hour. So, as Sarah Jane mentioned, neurodivergence in women and girls is the name of this workshop. I am the senior manager of youth and adult programs at LDS Learn, Develop, Succeed. We are a BC nonprofit charity whose mission is to support youth, children, and adults with unique learning profiles. So we offer a lot of individualized instruction for students aged 3 to 103 and beyond if somebody was that old and still wanted to do some learning. Um, so just to get started, the purpose of creating this workshop is because historically women have been underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed as neurodivergent. Many women spend much of their lives masking, especially in educational, workplace, and social settings. And after many years of masking, that can cause mental health issues, and there's not enough proper recognition and support. So this workshop will shed some light on those experiences, challenges, biases, and just offer some information about inclusion, self-acceptance, and advocacy. So I do want to start with a just a content warning because I will be discussing topics that might be sensitive or distressing. So I am going to be talking about gender-based discrimination, systemic oppression, and mental health challenges. Also going to be looking at the impacts of misdiagnosis, masking, and social exclusion of neurodivergent women and girls. So these topics might be deeply personal for you. They might bring up strong emotions. So like, please feel free to step away if you need to engage at your comfort level and seek support if you need it. Also going to mention not typically an issue, but if we do get any discriminatory comments, especially based on gender, neurodivergence, or other identities, we will not tolerate that. So that we want to make sure that this is a respectful and inclusive place where all voices are valued. So we just ask that when you are making comments or asking questions, that you are being empathetic and your goal is for collective well-being. So I am joining you this evening from the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. Our LDS Center is in the same area. And I just want to recognize that as we are talking about neurodivergent women and girls, we're also thinking about the systems of oppression, especially colonialism, ableism, and gender-based violence, and how we have disproportionately harmed Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people. So just recognizing the ongoing need for justice, safety, and systemic change. So as we are working toward a more inclusive world for neurodivergent women and girls, we're also committed to uplifting voices and experiences of those who have been silenced and honoring their resilience and ensuring that we're not leaving anybody behind in our fight for equality. So tonight I'm going to start by talking a little bit about International Women's Day, because that's coming up in just a couple of days. Then we'll do a brief overview of neurodiversity and societal bias, and then I'll talk a little more specifically about the female neurodivergent experience. I will also be poking in some reflective questions in the middle. You do not have to answer them. They are simply just something for you to ponder, and I'll be going through them pretty quickly, so not really giving you a whole lot of time to think about it, but if you want to take them down, maybe think about it afterwards. So the first reflection question being, how much time have you spent trying to change yourself? Great question. All right, so International Women's Day I'm sure most of us are familiar with it, but it is a celebration of women and their achievements with a call to action for gender equality. So, the very first Women's Day was observed in the United States on February 28th, 1909. And this was during advocacy by the Socialist Party of America, demanding that women have the right to be paid and that they have the right to demand higher wages. And so eventually, this movement became recognized in multiple countries across the globe, and it officially became an international celebration in 1911 with very similar causes. And then it was officially recognized by the United Nations on March 8th, 1977. International Women's Day is celebrated in many countries, either through rallies, discussions, or other initiatives that promote gender equity. So every year, the United Nations designates a theme for International Women's Day, which usually highlights some kind of ongoing challenge or progress. So this year, the theme is for all women and girls' rights, equality, and empowerment. And Canada actually does have a theme each year as well. And this year's theme for Canada is Strengthen Every Story, which is highlighting the importance of amplifying the voices of all women, especially those that face barriers. And so, while we've made a lot of strides in the fight for inclusion, representation, and equal opportunities, there's still a lot that needs to be done. And I'm sharing this resource here from the Government of Canada called the Gender Results Framework. So, this is essentially a resource where you can see how we as a country are advancing gender equality, and they have a lot of different like data points and research questions that looks at the way that we are addressing gender equality. It's quite an interesting resource if you have time to check it out. So thinking about women and society and International Women's Day, if you could change one societal expectation placed on women, what would it be? We'll talk a little bit more about societal expectations coming up. But first, we'll jump into neurodiversity. So if you're not familiar with it, neurodiversity is a relatively new term with multiple origins and refers to the full spectrum of brain-based differences. So to understand neurodiversity, it's really important to understand how your brain works. So it's kind of like an advanced computer. It takes in some information, it processes it, and then it spits back some sort of reaction. So if you've ever used AI before, like ChatGPT, you put in a query, it searches all of the information it has, and then it gives you a response. So your brain is similar to that process. It's a very simplified way of looking at it. So it will take in some information through your senses. So if you see something, hear something, taste something, touch something, it'll compare it to everything that you have already interacted with, and then it will produce a reaction. So you might produce an idea for problem solving, or you might have like a physical response to something. And different parts of your brain are going to handle different kinds of tasks like memory or problem solving or controlling movement. So when we are thinking about neurodiversity, that would be the differences in which people process information. And we can split that into two factions, neurodivergence and neurotypicality. So neurodivergence is the natural variance of brain function and ways of processing information, whereas neurotypicality are brain functions and ways of processing information that are considered standard. Um, So the opposite of being neurodivergent. And when we say neurodivergent, we're referring to an umbrella of many different terms, including dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. Those are known as specific learning disorders, ADHD, autism, cerebral palsy, PTSD, anxiety, and more. So anything that affects the way that your brain processes information can be considered some type of neurodivergence. And when we say neurodiversity, we're referring to every single brain. So that includes both neurodivergent brains and neurotypical brains. So when people think of neurodivergent, and you ask them to, describe a person that is neurodivergent, they often think about a hyperactive boy with ADHD who can't sit still and distracts everyone around them. Or maybe they think about a non-speaking autistic child that doesn't make eye contact with people. So we're still associating neurodivergent with a lot of rigid medical labels. And sometimes we assume that if you're neurodivergent, you are either a genius or you just cannot function in society. So we're still working on recognition that neurodivergence is a broad spectrum, and that when we think about these narratives of like a hyperactive boy or socially awkward scientist, that we're really overlooking the diversity that exists within the neurodivergent community. And so part of moving toward that is the neurodiversity paradigm. So throughout the 1990s, the term neurodiversity was used to uh, really challenge the medical model that stated that conditions like ADHD and autism were something to be fixed. So we needed to fix those things and treat those things. But the neurodiversity paradigm is the perspective or approach that states that neurodiversity is actually a natural and very and valuable form of human diversity. And it also states that the idea of a normal brain is actually culturally constructed. So instead of looking at it as something to be fixed or something to be solved, this paradigm celebrates those different ways of thinking, and highlights the fact that neurodiversity really makes our world a brighter, more interesting space. And so over time, as the neurodiversity paradigm started to grow and spread, it had grown into a movement. So by maybe the 2010s, it has become more of a mainstream concept. So we're hearing it a lot more in schools, workplaces, and disability rights. So it is really a social justice movement supporting equality, respect, and inclusion for neurodivergent individuals. And that's really what the whole basis of what LDS is a part of as well. So then the other half of this are the societal biases that we face in our society in neurodiversity and gender. So societal norms, values, expectations, and biases, whatever you want to refer to them as, really shape the way that we respond to differences. So while neurodivergent traits really exist across all human populations, what is considered normal or disordered really varies depending on cultural belief and even historical context sometimes. So the way that neurodivergence is diagnosed, the way that we understand it, the way that we support it is also influenced by that societal bias. So if we're looking at a culture that really values group-based socialization, autistic traits might be seen as deficits instead of differences. Um, Similarly, if we're thinking about like an ADHD trait like hyperactivity or impulsivity, that might be more acceptable in creative environments. But if you're in a structured setting, then it's more likely to be looked at as a deficit or a negative trait to have. So, just like we looked at neurodivergence as a culturally constructed concept, gender norms are also culturally constructed concepts. So, societal expectations dictate what is normal or acceptable behavior, which really leads to marginalization of people who don't fit within those expectations. So, if we are thinking about women, we're usually thinking about them in a way that is shaped by those societal depictions or cultural norms. So many people associate being a woman with qualities like being nurturing or empathetic, having high emotional intelligence, and taking care of everybody. And if we think about traditional gender roles, women are expected to be patient and self-sacrificing. And all of these things really overshadow female independence, autonomy, and the diverse experiences of females. And then in contrast, if you are a woman who doesn't conform to these expectations, so maybe being assertive or being independent, or maybe you're looked at as outspoken, you're often judged much more harshly. And also important to acknowledge that when we think about like the dominant woman in mainstream discourse, it's historically centered on white cisgender neurotypical experiences, and often does not consider the realities of women who might have different racial, cultural, or neurodivergent backgrounds. So, mainstream perceptions of neurodivergence are often shaped by cultural biases that favor male presenting traits, underestimating the impact of masking and overlooking how neurodivergence intersects with things like gender, race, and socioeconomic status. So, since neurodivergent women typically don't conform to traditional gender norms, they might be characterized as too intense or cold or difficult or mean, instead of actually being recognized as neurodivergent. So when we are expanding our understanding, we're really trying to recognize that there's no one way to be a woman. Um, Womanhood is it's very fluid, it's diverse, and every single woman has a different experience. So it really goes beyond those really narrow societal expectations or definitions. So when we recognize that concepts of normal are shaped by cultural values instead of inherent truths, we're really moving toward embracing ways of thinking that don't force people into restrictive categories. So trying to be a little bit more open. So if you are an Addams Family fan like me, I'm sharing a quote from Charles Addams. Normal is an illusion. What is normal to the spider is chaos to the fly. And so this was a line spoken by Morticia. And in other words, being whatever normal is very subjective. So what feels normal or ordinary to one person might feel confusing or overwhelming or dangerous to another. So in a broader sense, if you feel like, oh, this thing that I'm learning is super easy, it might be overwhelming to somebody else, or it might even be nonsense to somebody else. So really just a reminder that everyone has a different perspective. So your version of normal is not a universal version of normal. There's no such thing really as normal. So another reflection question for you, if society did not define normal, how would you show up differently in the world? So a lot of times we are trying to fit the norm, and the ways that we are raised to um, follow rules that make us appear normal. So if there was no such thing as normal, how would you show up differently? And so I'm going to move into the female neurodivergent experience. And before I do want to emphasize that when I talk about the female neurodivergent experience, the things that I say might not be the truth for every single person. And what I'm talking about reflects more common patterns and experiences. Neurodivergence is incredibly personal, and every single person's journey is valid. So if you are trying to find some connection here and your experience looks different, it doesn't make it any less valid. So just want to um, put that in your minds as we go through. So when we talk about neurodivergence in women and girls, there are many different factors to consider. So I've listed some here. This is not an exhaustive list, but more so some common themes. So we're thinking about things like misdiagnosis or missed diagnosis. We might be talking about masking, different ways of socializing, maybe having different levels of sensitivities, sensory processing differences, having intense interests, maybe being more hyper aware, or having internalized hyperactivity instead of externalized. So, some of the more significant ones here. So, the first one, if we're thinking about diagnostic criteria for neurodivergence, it's historically been based on research that's been conducted primarily on boys and men. And because women and girls have a lot of different experiences and they experience symptoms a lot differently, there has been a lot of widespread misdiagnosis or overlooked diagnosis or late diagnosis. So with this realization, there's actually been a 300% increase in autism diagnoses among adult women aged 26 to 34 in the last 5 years. So I'm sure if you are on any sort of social media, you are hearing lots about a lot of women being late diagnosed, especially with autism or ADHD. And it's not because, it's always existed. We just did not recognize it properly. And so like when people don't get that early recognition and support, you might struggle a lot with self-doubt or imposter syndrome, or just like this sense of not quite belonging with everybody else. And so, because of this, as we get to our second point, many neurodivergent females will cope by masking. So, masking is the act of unconsciously or consciously mimicking neurotypical behaviors to fit in. So as women, we are expected to be very socially skilled, have strong emotional intelligence, and be able to really nurture relationships effortlessly. So with masking, that might look like forcing eye contact or suppressing stims or rehearsing and reviewing social interaction. So what I mean by that is, if you're going to go into a social interaction, maybe you are rehearsing that over and over and over in your mind, and then once you leave that social interaction, you're reviewing it over and over and over in your mind to try to make sense of that situation and whether or not you showed up properly. Um, so, as you can imagine, or maybe you've experienced, if you are masking a lot of the time, um, that can be really mentally and emotionally exhausting, and that oftentimes leads to burnout. So even though it does create a sense of safety, a sense of false belonging, it can be extremely exhausting to do so. And then our next point, so a lot of times when we're talking about autism, you hear a lot about special interests. So boys and men are actually more likely to have special interests, whereas women are more likely to have hyperfixations. So women are more likely to have intense interests that aren't exactly aligned with special interests. So just more deeply interested in a subject rather than having this special interest. Um, and then similarly, or on that same wavelength, we typically see outward hyperactivity in neurodivergent boys and men, whereas women are more likely to experience internal hyperactivity. So that might look like racing thoughts or a restless mind or overthinking. That might also look like hyper awareness, so noticing every single detail, or hypervigilance. It might look like trying to predict or manage the emotions and behaviors of other people, which is also related to being highly empathetic and a tendency to over prepare for every single situation, to try to people please everybody, or be hyper responsible because there is a discomfort with unpredictability. So we are trying to control and manage, so that we are less likely to have to encounter some unpredictable factor, which can be really uncomfortable or difficult to deal with. And then finally, women tend to have stronger emotional reactions, rejection sensitivity, or mood swings than males. Whether or not that is also a factor of societal expectation on males to not show their feelings, but we just visibly see that women are more emotionally reactive than boys or men. And so, because of all of these different factors and the fact that we haven't done enough research on neurodivergence in women. I'm losing my voice. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to take a sip of my drink. Okay. Um, right. So because we haven't done enough research on neurodivergence in women, um, neurodivergent traits in women are frequently misinterpreted as other conditions. And then at the same time, because of chronic masking or feeling misunderstood, neurodivergent women tend to have higher rates of anxiety, depression, and burnout, anyways. So it's important to make the distinction between developing these conditions and being misdiagnosed with these conditions. So, for example, if somebody is misdiagnosed with anxiety or depression, and they are, in fact, neurodivergent, this is usually a secondary condition. And then when we are addressing anxiety and depression, it's not actually addressing the underlying cause. So if you're experiencing overwhelm, social challenges, or sensory sensitivities, that might be mistaken for anxiety, or if we're looking at burnout, rejection sensitivity, emotional dysregulation, that might be mistaken for depression. Emotional highs and lows may be mistaken for bipolar disorder. Um, we can even sometimes get misdiagnosed with an eating disorder if we have sensory sensitivities or rigid food preferences. And so when you are treating these conditions, you're not supporting the underlying neurodivergence. And so sometimes, for example, if you are diagnosed with anxiety because you have a lot of social challenges, but in fact, you actually have ADHD, if you are treating anxiety disorder with a specific medication or approach, it might not actually work for the ADHD. And then you kind of feel like there's something wrong with you because all of these things that are supposed to be helping your anxiety aren't actually doing anything. And it's because you don't have the proper support and the proper knowledge to recognize that it's actually something else. And that, if you're supporting the ADHD instead, it can make such a significant difference. But again, you can have both, because when you are neurodivergent, you're more likely to have comorbidities. So if you have ADHD, you are also more likely to have anxiety. So it's really like it's a big, messy puzzle. And again, we don't have enough research and knowledge about it in order to be able to address it effectively. So, um, like the very first reflection question I asked you, many women spend years trying to fix themselves instead of acknowledging or recognizing that they need some kind of accommodation or support. So When you are late diagnosed or you're reading about it and you are self-diagnosing, realizing that you are neurodivergent can be a relief, but it can also cause a lot of grief. So you might feel like you've lost a lot of years where if you just had that right support, maybe you'd be somewhere else. Um, but it's really not the end. So if you are somebody who suspects that you might be neurodivergent, if you might have been misdiagnosed, or if you have some sort of dismissal from medical professionals, it's really not the end of the road. Making sure that you're looking at specific research on symptoms in females, even though there's not as much of it. Looking for shared lived experience too is one of the best sources of information. Um, Especially if you meet other neurodivergent women. Um, my personal hot take after working in this field and being a neurodivergent person is that neurotypical people should not be diagnosing neurodivergence. You can argue that with me later if you like. Um, Find practitioners with expertise in neurodivergence. So it's becoming more and more mainstream. And there are some really wonderful medical practitioners who do take the time to educate themselves and recognize those symptoms. And of course, like diagnosis, it can be really validating to have that person with a medical degree to say, like, yes, you are divergent. Yes, you have ADHD. But it's not the only path to self-understanding. So self-diagnosis is very valid in the neurodivergent community, and community support can be incredibly helpful. And whether or not you have a diagnosis, you can still implement different kinds of strategies at home, at work, or at school. Um, so just to give a plug to LDS, um, we will consider applications whether you are diagnosed or not, and we'll offer you support whether you're diagnosed or not. And we recognize self-diagnosis as being completely valid because there are so many barriers to getting that diagnosis. And your experience is your experience, and nobody else can tell you any different. So clearly, we need increased awareness and improved diagnostic criteria that accounts for all of these gender differences in symptom presentation, and also needing more timely support and intervention for everybody. So we all exist on a spectrum of identities and expressions, um, and even if they are shaped by these normal cultural values, we can still take steps to really discovering who we are, and move toward embracing those different ways of thinking, um, and really just recognizing that we can't be forced into restrictive categories. We're all very different. Um, so the main way to do that is really through radical acceptance, which is the practice of fully embracing ourselves. Some ways that we can practice radical acceptance are by reframing the narrative. So, rewriting the story of your identity, looking at new possibilities for yourself, and just moving toward living a life where you are building resilience, you are practicing self compassion, and really taking the opportunity to forgive yourself, which is really challenging, but that can improve many aspects of your life, and recognizing that it's not your fault that you were not diagnosed early, or, it's not on you to try and fit in a world that wasn't made for you. Um, Recognizing your needs, setting boundaries, and finding those spaces where you can really fully embrace your authentic self, where you can start practicing unmasking and just really embracing your neurodivergent identity. So that can be very liberating, not only for you, but for people around you too. Because you notice that once you have radical acceptance for yourself, people are more likely to feel comfortable in doing the same for themselves. So the last reflection question, how will you challenge societal expectations for neurodivergent women and girls? And so from LDS, this International Women's Day, we commit to celebrating neurodivergent women and girls, not only for their incredible resilience in navigating a society that was not built for them, but also for their creativity, passion, and uniqueness that bring color to our world. So we want to make space for every woman and girl to be valued and understood, and advocate for the improved research, improved support, and really come together as a community. So before we get into time for some questions, just want to let you know a little bit about us at LDS and the kind of information and support that we provide. We provide level B assessments. One of the most useful, particularly for adults, is our brief, which is the executive functioning assessment. So this report gives you an executive functioning profile, which can be really helpful when trying to get supports at home or at work. We offer professional development and workshops. So we have a community workshop once a month, and they are posted on our website afterwards. So if you've missed any, you can go look for them. We do also professional development workshops where we go into schools, workplaces, or anywhere else. We offer one-to-one instruction in person in East Vancouver, North Vancouver. We have some partner schools and online and our mobile classroom. If you're in Vancouver, you might have seen it driving around sometimes. We have some other formal assessments, assistive technology services, family coaching, and of course our adult learning program, my personal favorite program. And everything is offered on a sliding scale based on income. We try to reduce barriers to accessing these programs as much as possible. And so again, these community workshops are free. We are a nonprofit charity. We receive very, very little funding from the government. And most of the funds that we do get to support our learners all comes from donations, fundraising, and grant funding. People do not need a diagnosis to get access to learning support. And 77% of our families access our Bright Futures Bursary Fund. So essentially what we're asking is if you are in a position to be able to support our Bright Futures Bursary Fund, you can scan this QR code. Every single dollar makes a huge difference. And I'll just leave that up for a moment. We do also have, I'll mention that we have a fundraiser coming up, Rise to the Top. I don't know if that's actually the name. I'm sorry if it's not, but essentially it's a fundraiser at the Grouse Grind. So if you really love climbing stairs, keep your eye out for that. And yeah, thank you so much.